A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Korn, and I am joined as always by my brother, Herman Poppleberry. We have a really dense one today, and honestly, it is a topic that has been sitting in the back of my mind for months, but a specific report that dropped today, March 12, 2026, really forced our hand. We are talking about the very foundation of how we receive sensitive information, the plumbing of the Fourth Estate, and the increasingly blurry line between journalism and state-sanctioned information warfare.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are right, Korn. This one is timely, and frankly, it is a bit unsettling if you care about the integrity of the news. Our housemate Daniel actually sent us this prompt after seeing the headlines this morning. There is a massive Reuters report out today regarding the internal stability of the Iranian government following the last few weeks of intense military pressure and bombardment from the United States and Israel. And while the geopolitical implications of a stable Tehran are huge, what Daniel really wanted us to dig into was the way the story was sourced. It is a masterclass in what we call the authorized disclosure.
The headline is what people will tweet about, but the plumbing of the article is where the real story lives. For those who haven't seen the why yet, Reuters is reporting that according to United States intelligence assessments, the government in Tehran is actually quite stable and not at risk of imminent collapse, despite the heavy bombardment of their strategic facilities. Now, that flies directly in the face of the official narrative coming out of the White House over the last 72 hours, but the thing that caught Daniel's eye, and certainly caught mine, was a very specific phrase in the attribution. Reuters wrote that their sources were, quote, granted permission to speak, end quote.
That is the smoking gun, Korn. That phrase is doing so much heavy lifting, and it is almost entirely invisible to the casual reader who is just scanning for the latest on the conflict. Usually, when we talk about anonymous sources, we think of the deep throat archetype, right? We think of a whistleblower meeting a reporter in a dark parking garage, risking their career, their pension, and their freedom to get the truth out because the system is trying to suppress it. But when you see the phrase granted permission to speak, you are looking at the exact opposite of a whistleblower. You are looking at a conduit.
It is basically a press release in a trench coat. If you are granted permission to speak on the condition of anonymity, you are not a rebel. You are an instrument of an agency's communication strategy. And today, we want to peel back the curtain on that murky world of anonymous sourcing. We are going to look at the different types of attribution, the mechanics of how reporters protect these people, and the very real risks of a news organization being played by the people they're supposed to be covering. This isn't just about one Reuters article. It is about the erosion of the boundary between the state and the press.
It is a vital conversation because, according to Pew Research data from the last few years, anonymous sourcing remains one of the top 3 drivers of public skepticism toward the media. People feel like it is a black box. They feel like a reporter can just make up a source, or that the source is using the reporter to lie to the public. And in some historical cases, as we will discuss, that is exactly what happened. When the public sees senior officials hiding behind a veil of anonymity to push a narrative that they were authorized to push anyway, it feels like a shell game.
So, let's start with the taxonomy of this, Herman, because I think most people see the word anonymous and assume it all means the same thing. But in the world of high-level journalism, there is a very strict, almost ritualistic hierarchy of how you attribute information. It is like a secret language that reporters and officials use to signal to each other and to the savvy reader what is actually happening. What is the difference between someone speaking on background versus deep background or off the record?
This is where it gets technical, and it is something every news consumer should understand. These are not legal terms, by the way. They are professional agreements between a reporter and a source. If I am talking to you on background, it means I am giving you information that you can use, and you can quote me, but you cannot use my name. Instead, we have to agree on a description, like a senior administration official or a person familiar with the matter. This is the bread and butter of Washington reporting.
Right, and that is where you get those vague descriptors that drive people crazy. A senior official could be the vice president, or it could be a mid-level deputy assistant secretary.
Now, deep background is even more restrictive. If I give you info on deep background, you can use the information, but you cannot attribute it to anyone at all. You have to write it as if it is just a known fact, using phrases like, "it is understood that," or "it has been learned that." This is the most dangerous one for a reporter because they are essentially putting their own credibility on the line for information they cannot even point to a source for. They are saying, "Trust me, I know this is true, but I can't tell you how I know."
And then there is off the record, which is the one everyone gets wrong because of the movies. People think off the record means you can use it, but just don't say you said it.
Totally wrong. In real journalism, if something is truly off the record, the reporter cannot use that information in the story at all. Period. It is for the reporter's situational awareness only. It helps them understand the context so they can go find that same information from a different source who will go on the record or at least on background. If a reporter publishes something told to them off the record, they have committed the ultimate professional sin. They have burned the bridge.
So, looking back at this Reuters report from today, where does granted permission to speak fit into that hierarchy? Because that feels like a new category entirely, or at least a very honest admission of a very old practice. It is almost like they are saying, "We know this is a plant, and we want you to know we know."
It is a fascinating evolution. Usually, the standard boilerplate is something like, "the source spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the matter publicly." That implies a sense of rebellion, right? It suggests the source is breaking the rules to tell you the truth. But when Reuters says they were granted permission to speak, they are signaling that the intelligence community, as an institution, wanted this information out there. They just didn't want a specific name attached to it. It is a managed leak. It is the agency saying, "We want to counter the president's optimism about the bombardment, but we don't want to have a public fight with the commander-in-chief."
Which suggests a massive internal rift. If the president is saying the Iranian regime is on the ropes, and the intelligence agencies are using Reuters to say, actually, they are fine, then the agencies are using anonymity to bypass the executive branch's policy. They are using the press as a pressure valve to counter the political leadership's narrative, without having to have an intelligence director stand at a podium and call the president a liar. It is a bureaucratic maneuver carried out through the medium of a newswire.
And that is exactly where the line between journalism and information warfare gets very, very thin. When a reporter accepts those terms, they are essentially agreeing to be a part of that bureaucratic maneuver. Now, the reporter would argue they are providing the public with a more accurate picture of the intelligence assessment, which is true. But they are also allowing themselves to be used as a tool in an internal power struggle. They are laundering a specific faction's viewpoint.
It makes me think about the verification paradox. We have talked about this before in the context of other episodes, like when we looked at the architecture of information in global conflict back in episode 944. There is this tension between the need for speed and the need for verification. The gold standard for decades was the two-source rule, popularized by Ben Bradley at the Washington Post during Watergate. You don't run it unless two independent sources confirm it. But how does that work in 2026, when the news cycle moves at the speed of a refresh button, and the sources are being granted permission by the same boss?
It is getting harder and harder, Corn. And here's the thing about the two-source rule, it is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean two people who heard the same rumor, it means two people with independent access to the primary information. If I have two sources in the same office who both saw the same memo, that is great. But if I have one source who saw the memo and another source who just heard about the memo from the first guy, I don't have two sources. I have one source and an echo. In the case of this Reuters report, if the intelligence community is granting permission to multiple people to speak, you could easily get 5 sources who are all telling you the exact same authorized talking points. It looks like a consensus, but it is actually just a single, coordinated leak. It creates an illusion of credibility through volume.
This brings us to the dark side of this practice, the times when the press was played like a fiddle. We have to talk about the Judith Miller case at the New York Times in the lead-up to the Iraq War. That is probably the most famous failure of anonymous sourcing in modern history. You had high-profile reporters who were talking to anonymous officials within the Bush administration who were telling them about weapons of mass destruction, mobile biological weapons labs, and aluminum tubes.
And the genius, or the deviousness of that operation was the feedback loop. The administration would leak a story to the New York Times. The Times would publish it using anonymous sources. Then, the next morning, the Vice President or the Secretary of State would go on the Sunday talk shows and say, as the New York Times reported this morning, there is evidence of these weapons. They were using the prestige of the newspaper to launder their own claims and then using the newspaper's report as independent confirmation of their own intelligence. It was a closed loop. It was a hall of mirrors. And because the sources were anonymous, the public couldn't see that the person leaking the info and the person citing the report were essentially on the same team.
There was also the case of Curveball, the Iraqi defector in Germany. He was a single source who claimed to have worked on mobile bioweapons labs. The CIA never even spoke to him directly. They were getting the info secondhand from German intelligence. But because that info fit the narrative the administration wanted to build, it was treated as gospel and leaked to the press as ironclad intelligence from multiple sources. It turned out he was just making it all up to get a green card. That is the verification paradox in action. The most sensitive, high-stakes information is often the hardest to verify because, by definition, very few people have access to it. If you are reporting on a secret intelligence assessment about Iran today, March 12th, there might only be 10 people in the world who have read the full document. If you can't get 2 of them to talk, do you sit on the story? Or do you run it with one source who is granted permission and hope you aren't being fed a line?
It is a brutal choice for an editor. And it leads to what I call the boilerplate test. When I read an article now, I look for those specific phrases. If I see sources close to the situation, I immediately get skeptical. Close to could mean the guy who cleans the office. It could mean a consultant who talked to a guy who talked to a guy. It is proximity-based, not access-based. Or, my personal favorite, sources familiar with the thinking of. What does that even mean? It is so abstract. It is basically a license to speculate while pretending it is a fact. It is journalistic palm reading.
We should talk about the mechanics of how these sources are actually protected, though. Because even if a source is authorized, like in the Reuters case, there is still a high degree of tradecraft involved. Reporters aren't just taking calls on their cell phones anymore, especially with the surveillance capabilities we have in 2026.
No, certainly not. In 2026, the digital trail is the biggest threat to any source, authorized or not. Most major news organizations now have secure drop servers. For those who don't know, secure drop is a digital dead drop. It uses the Tor network to mask the IP address of the person uploading documents, so the news organization itself doesn't even know where the file came from unless the source tells them. It is designed so that even if the newsroom is subpoenaed, they literally don't have the data to give up.
And then there is Signal. I think every person in Washington, Jerusalem, and London has Signal on their phone now. It is the industry standard for encrypted messaging. But even that isn't a silver bullet. We saw this in the last few years with several high-profile leak investigations where the government didn't need to break the encryption. They just got the metadata. They could see that a reporter and a source were messaging each other at 2 a.m, right before a story dropped. You don't need to know what they said to know they were talking. Metadata is the footprint in the snow.
That is a huge point. Metadata is often more damning than the content itself. And this brings up the legal reality that I think a lot of people don't realize. There is no federal shield law in the United States. While most states have shield laws that protect journalists from having to reveal their sources in state court, there is no such protection at the federal level. If a federal prosecutor subpoenas a reporter to identify a source in a national security case, that reporter has 2 choices: talk or go to jail.
Like Judith Miller did. She spent 85 days in jail in 2005 to protect her source in the Plame affair. For those who don't remember, that was when high-level officials leaked the identity of Valerie Plame, a covert CIA officer, to punish her husband for writing an op-ed that challenged the administration's Iraq narrative. That is a perfect example of the source being the villain of the story. Usually, we think of the reporter and the source as the heroes fighting the system. In the Plame case, the sources were powerful officials using the press to destroy a whistleblower's wife. It was a complete inversion of the traditional journalistic ethics. And yet, the reporters still felt they had to protect those sources to maintain their credibility for future leaks.
It is a strange kind of honor among thieves. But it really highlights why the public trust is so low. If you are using your anonymity to smear someone or to push a political agenda, why should you be protected? But from the reporter's perspective, if you burn one source, you will never get another one. It is professional suicide. Which is why editorial discipline is so important. A good editor should be asking the reporter, who is this person? What is their motive? Why won't they go on the record? And most importantly, what happens if they are lying to us? Reuters actually has some of the stricter editorial standards on this. They are supposed to avoid using anonymous sources. Unless the information is vital, the source is reliable, and there is no other way to get it.
And yet, here we are today with a story that is almost entirely built on these granted permission sources. And I have to wonder about the timing. We are on March 12th. The bombardment has been going on for weeks. The political pressure on the administration is peaking. Suddenly, this report drops saying, hey, the status quo is actually fine. It feels like a very deliberate attempt to slow-roll the policy or to provide an off-ramp for the military operations. It definitely feels like a policy intervention. And that brings us to the distinction between a leak and a plant. A leak is something the government doesn't want you to know. A plant is something the government, or a faction within it, wants you to believe. When you see granted permission to speak, you are almost certainly looking at a plant.
So, as a listener, as someone trying to navigate the news today, how do you distinguish between the two? Because it is not always as obvious as it is in this Reuters report. I think you have to look at the beneficiary. We talked about this in our episode on the human element of spying, episode 87095. You have to ask who benefits from this specific narrative being public right now. If the story makes the government look incompetent or reveals a secret crime, it is probably a genuine leak. If the story supports a specific policy goal or counters a rival agency's narrative, it is likely a plant.
It is also worth looking at the level of detail. Genuine leaks often come with documents, specific dates, and names of programs. Plants tend to be more thematic. They're about assessments and feelings and general consensus. They're designed to create a vibe rather than to prove a fact. The vibe check of journalism. And honestly, this is where I think things are going to change significantly in the next few years. We covered this in episode 1096 when we talked about intelligence-grade OSINT and the rise of agentic AI. As these AI tools get better at analyzing satellite imagery, tracking financial flows, and monitoring social media in real time, the value of the anonymous human source might actually start to decline.
Because you won't need a guy in the basement of the CIA to tell you the Iranian government is stable if you can see that their supply chains are still moving, their power grid is up, and their internal communications are still encrypted and functioning. You can verify the reality through open source intelligence without having to trust a nameless official with an axe to grind. AI can do the verification that the two-source rule was supposed to do, but at a much larger scale. It could actually lead to a more transparent era of journalism where reporters have to show their work. Instead of saying sources say, they can say, based on our analysis of 4,000 data points from these 15 open source streams, we assess that X is happening. That is much harder to fake and much easier for the public to audit.
But we aren't there yet. Right now, we are still in the era of the authorized disclosure, and I think we need to talk about the ethics of the reporter in this scenario. If you're a reporter at Reuters, and you get a call from an intel official saying, I have been authorized to tell you this on the condition that you don't use my name, do you take it? Or do you say, if you are authorized to tell me, then you are authorized to go on the record?
That is the million-dollar question. Most reporters would take the deal because they want the scoop. They don't want their competitor at the Associated Press or the New York Times to get it instead. The competitive pressure of the industry practically mandates that you accept the terms of the source, even if those terms are nonsensical. If you insist on them going on the record, they will just hang up and call someone who is more compliant. It is a race to the bottom in terms of transparency, and it creates this weird situation where the most powerful people in the world are the ones who get to be anonymous. We usually think of anonymity as a shield for the weak, but in modern journalism, it is frequently a cloak for the powerful.
That is such a sharp point, Herman, and it is why organizations like Honest Reporting or Camera are often so critical of Middle East coverage. They point out that anonymous sources are frequently used to shield officials from accountability for biased or inaccurate statements. If an anonymous official says something inflammatory about Israel or Iran, there is no one to hold responsible when that statement turns out to be false. The reporter just says, "Well, that is what I was told." It is a get-out-of-jail-free card for everyone involved. The source gets to move the needle on policy without taking the heat. The reporter gets a front-page story. The news organization gets the clicks. The only person who loses is the reader, who is left trying to figure out if they are reading a piece of journalism or a sophisticated psychological operation.
And that is why we wanted to do this episode today. Because even if you agree with the content of the report, even if you think the Iranian government is stable and that the bombardment should stop, you should still be concerned about the way that information is being delivered to you. The process matters as much as the product. If we accept a world where the government can just grant permission to people to speak anonymously whenever they want to bypass political leadership, we are essentially accepting a world where the intelligence community has its own private press corps.
It really does. So let's look at some practical takeaways for the people listening. When you open a news app tomorrow, what is the mental checklist you should be running through when you see an anonymous source?
First, look for the granted permission marker. If you see that, or anything like it, treat the information as an official government statement, not a secret revelation. It is a press release with a mask on. Second, look for the why. Ask yourself, why is this being told to me today? Not yesterday, not next week, but right now. What is happening in the news cycle that this information is trying to push back against or support? Third, check the specificity. Is the source giving you hard facts, numbers, and dates? Or are they giving you adjectives and feelings? Sources familiar with the thinking of are usually just professional spin doctors.
And fourth, check the diversity of the sourcing. Is it just one person, or is it multiple independent groups? If the story says according to officials across 3 different agencies, that is much more credible than senior officials, which could just be 2 guys in the same department. And finally, don't be afraid to be skeptical. Anonymity should be the exception, not the rule. If a story is 80% anonymous sourcing, it is a house of cards. It might be a very pretty house, but it doesn't take much to knock it down.
I think that is a really solid framework. It is about becoming an active consumer rather than a passive one. We are in an era where information is being weaponized from every direction, and the traditional gatekeepers are often just as compromised as the people they are covering. It is a tough environment, but it is also a fascinating one. If you can learn to read between the lines, you can actually learn more from the way a story is written than from the story itself. The attribution is the map of the power dynamics behind the scenes.
Well, I think we have thoroughly deconstructed the plumbing of the Reuters report today. It is a murky world, but hopefully this gives people a bit of a flashlight to navigate it. Herman, any final thoughts before we wrap this one up?
Just that we should always remember that the word anonymous doesn't mean unknown. The reporter knows exactly who these people are. The editors know who they are. The news organization's lawyers often know who they are. The only person who is kept in the dark is you, the reader. And in a democracy, that should always be a cause for concern. If the source is granted permission to speak, you aren't reading a leak. You are reading a sanctioned narrative.
Very well said, and that is a perfect place to leave it. If you found this discussion helpful, or if you have your own thoughts on the state of journalism today, we would love to hear from you. You can head over to myweirdprompts.com and use the contact form there. You can also find our full archive of over 1,100 episodes, including the ones we referenced today, like episode 967 on the tradecraft of journalism in Tehran.
And if you are enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a quick review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and keeps us going. We are also on Telegram. Just search for My Weird Prompts to get notified every time we drop a new episode.
Thanks again to Daniel for sending in this prompt. It was a great excuse to dive into something we have been wanting to talk about for a long time. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the sources.
See you in the next one.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to